Hi everyone, I'm Rita, and today I'll talk to you a bit about my PhD work, which was on trying to understand the development of rifting and magmatism in the Turkana Depression, which is this broad low-lying region between the elevated Ethiopian and East African plateaus. So precisely how the East African rift developed through this region is uncertain. And it's complicated by the fact that the depression had already experienced a phase of rifting during the Mesozoic, about 50 million years prior to the formation of the East African rift, shown by these northwest-southeast trending rift basins. So key to understanding the region are some constraints on lithospheric structure. And we've been able to do that since the deployment of the Trail Seismic Network in 2019. And that's this series of 34 broadband seismograph stations that have plugged this gap between the two plateaus. So we've used data from these stations, as well as surrounding stations in East Africa, to seismically image the lithosphere using surface waves and receiver functions. And through that, we illuminate regions of active rifting and also melt infiltration. So for a bit of context, so the East African rift generally traverses two elevated plateaus and is also accompanied by widespread Cenozoic volcanism that's thought to be plume related. So within these two plateaus, the East African rift generally has manifested into relatively narrow, about 100-kilometer wide rift valleys, so the main Ethiopian rift and Eastern rift. And how these two interlink through the Turkana Depression is poorly understood. And like I mentioned previously, the fact that there's a failed Mesozoic rift system traversing the East African rift almost orthogonally makes this region a little bit more complicated. So how the rifting developed, whether it's broadly or focused through the region, is uncertain. But another question that we were trying to answer is the style of rifting through the area, whether it's more magmatically driven or mechanical. So if we take a look at the region more closely, to the north and south of the Turkana Depression, in the main Ethiopian rift and Eastern rift, we have quite focused rifting whose extension is accommodated by magmatic intrusions. But to what extent is this still the case throughout the Turkana Depression? Well, the first clue that this might not be the case is the presence of Lake Turkana itself, which is this major fault-bounded rift basin. But we also know that rift basins just to the west of the lake have also accommodated a lot of extension throughout the Miocene. So what we want to do is to investigate the lithospheric structure in the region and see whether we can highlight regions of magmatism. So if we take a look at shear wave velocity profiles throughout an area, what we would expect to see in a magmatic rift, such as the main Ethiopian rift, is something akin to this red line, where you would expect sort of melt and heating in the mantle lithosphere to blur the transition between the mantle lithosphere and a stenosphere. And you would also expect a more gradational moho resulting from sort of lower crustal mafic intrusions. In contrast, though, if we had more of a melt pore, mechanically rifted, unmodified system, you'd expect to see something more like this solid black line, where you'd still be able to clearly see the mantle lithosphere above a slow wave speed asthenosphere. And you'd also see a sharper moho. Sorry, I don't know if anyone can see that. Yeah, and also a sharper moho. So one place where we know we can see this in the depression is probably going to be southern Ethiopia. So here we've previously imaged, which I've highlighted in blue, a fast wave speed band in our body wave tomography that we've interpreted as Proterozoic lithosphere. And that coincides quite well with where rifting becomes a lot more distributed. And that you can see through the seismicity as well, sort of covering a much broader region. So our goal here is to try and image the lithosphere and see whether we can see any evidence for melt. So what we've seen already with some of the other Trails work, so Chris Ogden, another postdoc on the project, has done receiver function work to try and find the bulk crustal VPVS ratios and crustal thickness throughout the Turkana Depression. And what we found was that there's quite low VPVS ratios throughout the depression, and they're not too dissimilar to the neighboring craton, which is melt poor. And we can also see quite a thin crust throughout the region. And these two are characteristic of a melt poor, more mechanically stretched rift system. So one of my goals was to try to image the lithospheric structure sort of beneath the crust, the mantle lithosphere, and see what the wave speeds look like there. So the first thing we did was surface wave tomography to try and illuminate lateral variations in wave speeds from crustal to uppermost mantle depths. And we've used surface waves, and Rayleigh waves are a type of surface wave from regional earthquakes around the Turkana Depression. And we exploit their dispersive nature, where you'd have group velocity for each of these earthquakes would vary as a function of period. And then you can easily link that to as a function of depth. So jointly inverting all of the earthquake data sets, we end up with group velocities as a function of latitude and longitude for each period, and also simultaneously invert for anisotropy. So you'd expect to see strong anisotropy in areas of melt, for example, as opposed to areas that are melt poor. So that's another observation that we're going to look at later. So we take our surface wave constraints a step further, and we jointly invert them. So our group velocity versus period data set, we jointly invert it with receiver functions, which are really good at pinpointing depths to discontinuities in the subsurface, such as the MOHO and lithosphere-asthenosphere boundary. And from that, we can end up with a shear wave velocity profile beneath each of our stations in the Turkana Depression. And from this, we'd be able to find the MOHO, which should be at the base of the steep velocity gradient, and also the lithosphere-asthenosphere system, which would be as soon as wave speeds start reducing into the asthenosphere below a fast wave speed mantle lithosphere. But the first few results I'm going to talk through are some of our surface wave constraints. So taking some cross sections through our surface wave tomographic model across the Turkana Depression, we can see quite a thin crust and quite thick, slow wave speed sedimentary basins, which are characteristic of a more stretched system as opposed to a magmatic one. So the main Ethiopian rift, for example, has a much thicker crust than is present below the Turkana Depression. However, though, we can also see in the Miocene to recent rift basins just west of the lake, which is where the East African rift developed, we can see slightly faster wave speeds than below the Mesozoic rift basins, and that could be a result of more significant igneous infill, some of volcanic lithologies in this basin, which would be consistent with the fact that more recently there have been dike intrusions right below the lake itself that could be hinting to a more recent magmatic system developing in the area. And if we zoom into the most recent rift basins in the region, we can see quite slow wave speeds in the mantle lithosphere, and that could signify thermomechanical modification. But the wave speeds here aren't quite as slow as the main Ethiopian rift, where we have voluminous melt. So instead, it's likely more caused by a thermal anomaly. And when we look at the anisotropy in Lake Turkana, which is where the present day locus of strain currently resides, it's a lot weaker than what we see in the main Ethiopian rift, where magmatic intrusions align with the rift axis, causing a strong anisotropic signature. So all of these are sort of pointing to a less magmatically dominated system. Having a look at our shear wave velocity profiles with depth, there's two interesting things that come out of this. The first is that we can see a slightly more sharp MOHO below different regions in the Turkana Depression, as opposed to the Ethiopian plateau, which I've highlighted here in black. And that suggests a lack of lower crustal intrusions in Turkana as compared to the Ethiopian plateau further north. But what's more interesting is that we can clearly see a high wave speed mantle lithosphere throughout the depression, something that isn't as easily seen further north in the Ethiopian plateau. probably because it's been significantly modified with slower wave speed material being imparted into the lithosphere. So to summarize, it looks like in the Turkana Depression, we're looking at fundamentally different styles of rifting as compared to the main Ethiopian rift. We've got thick sedimentary basins, a thinner crust, and relatively unmodified mantle lithosphere, which all points to a more mechanically dominated system. However, there is some evidence for melt, primarily below Lake Turkana itself, some evidence of thermomechanical modification. So magma-assisted rifting is currently underway, but it's just perhaps not as established as the main Ethiopian rift further north.
You're at 10 minutes now.
Sorry, is that okay?
You're at 10 minutes now. Everything's good.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Great. And then another interesting feature that was revealed from our surface wave tomographic models was fast mantle wave speeds below southern Ethiopia, which coincide quite nicely with where we previously imaged this band of Proterozoic lithosphere. So this area here marks the southernmost extent of very focused main Ethiopian rifting. So it's likely that this area here is more refractory and has acted as some sort of rheological barrier to the development of rifting through the region, as evidenced by sort of the more distributed faulting and seismicity, and also a thicker crust and lack of sedimentary basins in the region. And perhaps even more intriguingly is we see fast mantle lithospheric wave speeds below the failed Mesozoic rift system. So it seems that Cenozoic rifting has avoided sort of this part of Turkana. It's sort of developed further west below the lake. And that's why we still have today relatively fast mantle lithosphere. And we can also see evidence for this with the anisotropy, where it parallels Mesozoic rift fabrics as opposed to north to south East African rift related rifting. So all in all, it looks like Mesozoic structures haven't been thermally modified subsequently to their formation. And we can clearly see this through our shear wave velocity profiles through both areas in southern Ethiopia and Mesozoic and below the Mesozoic rifts. We see this high wave speed lid that clearly isn't present below the Ethiopian plateau, sort of suggesting that magmatism isn't as volumetrically significant as further north. Great, so to summarize, throughout the Turkana Depression, we have a relatively thin crust and thick sedimentary basins with high stretching factors that all point to a more mechanically stretched lithosphere. It's only below Lake Turkana where there's some evidence for dike intrusion and magmatic extension, but that must only be very young since it hasn't developed to the extent that we could see it in our surface wave tomographic models. But also influencing how the rifting developed through the region is this fast wave speed Proterozoic lithosphere in southern Ethiopia that seems to have acted as some sort of rheological barrier to rifting in the region. But also we see that Mesozoic rift basins have failed to be exploited by any subsequent phases of rifting, which instead developed further west below Lake Turkana. So just before ending, I thought I would just highlight that there's lots going on currently with the Trails project. So there's lots of PhD students, postdocs, and senior researchers all working on different techniques to try and understand rift developments through the Turkana Depression. So if you're interested, check out some of these papers that are currently published and some in prep. Great, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Rita. Fantastic talk. Nice overview. I'm sure there are several questions. If you have a question, please type it in the chat or raise your hands. And then you will get the word. Tanya, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed this talk. And one of the things that made me happy is everything that you said makes complete sense with at least my understanding of the magmatic chemistry.
All right,
and
great.
I'm gonna cite one of your slides later when we talk, but I really enjoyed seeing these data come out. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tanya.
I have a question about this Proterozoic lithosphere. You call it refractory. Can you explain a bit what you mean by it is a barrier and how it mechanically affects rift localization, or like hypothesize a bit about that?
Yeah. So we've called it refractory in the sense that it's probably stronger sort of than surrounding area. And because of that, it might have prevented strain from localizing in a particular location, straight through sort of southern Ethiopia. So I don't know, sort of from a rheology point of view, that's something I probably would go away and model. But I guess from our seismic constraints, it just looks like it's unmodified, fast wave speed, thick lithosphere, and coupling that together with sort of the geology, which is distributed seismicity that has failed to localize, distributed faulting, and there's also some xenolith data not far from southern Ethiopia, somewhere around here, that points to ancient sort of Proterozoic lithosphere. Putting all that together, I think that's how we came up with the idea that it's probably refractory. And there's also, not far from here in southwest Ethiopia, an island arc accretionary zone, an ultramafic zone. So that could hint at some sort of compositional heterogeneity in the area, so something that's a bit more mechanically strong. But yeah, there's definitely lots to think about.
I find that very interesting, because if we model mechanically strong lithosphere, then it usually means that it needs a lot of energy to create faults and deformation. And so it rather localizes into one narrow rift basin where it only needs one big fault, or like a few big faults. But here you have a broader area of deformation, which is maybe due to the 3D structure of the whole evolution, but something that requires further research.
Yeah, definitely interesting.
Sarah, last question. Sarah, you want to ask the question yourself?
Sure. I was just wondering if there's any way you've been able to differentiate the prior phase of crustal thinning, like the much older extension that happened in the region, to the more recent phase of crustal thinning.
So that's a good question. So looking at sort of other data sets like reflection seismics, wide angle studies that have happened in the region, it looks like the majority of the more recent phases of rifting, sort of East African rift related, happened west of the lake. Whereas further east, it looks like the majority of that was from the Mesozoic phase of rifting, so the much older one. But this is mostly from sort of borehole data, wide angle seismics. But it's not something I've necessarily been able to constrain myself, I don't think. Yeah.
Thanks.
Great, no problem. But I can point you to some of the work that we've been looking at to sort of, so wide angle seismics, it would be lots of work by Chris Morley, Schofield, and yeah, lots of borehole data in the area as well from those papers.